and then
Resume
we'll mostly
recording.
disappear
Okay.
and then
Present
hit
on,
present.
okay. And then go to Canva. All right, where did you guys go? Canva. Present. Okay, we're recording.
Perfect. Well, um, our presentation is titled From Fragmentation to Faith, the Development of T.S. Eliot's Search for Meaning, and is presented by myself, Marisa Guy, Rachel Wood, Karen Silva, and Katie Bird.
Run the slides.
So the objectives that we will be covering within this presentation is tracing the evolution of Eliot's major themes across his career, examining how Eliot's personal experiences influenced his poetry, analyze representative early and later poems through close reading, explore the relationship between modernist fragmentation and Eliot's growing interest in faith, and think about whether Eliot's body of work ultimately offers a vision of hope or simply a different way of understanding suffering. So, to begin, we do need to have a deeper understanding of who T.S. Eliot is, and that starts with his early life. He was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1888, but that is not necessarily where he resided his entire life. It was just for a brief little moment. But he actually comes from a Bostonian elite family lineage, so he comes well off. And he actually has ties to East Coker in Somerset, England, which is a setting that will be referenced in one of the chapters of Four Quartets, which is one of his later poems. And Ackroyd, who has a biography of T.S. Eliot's life, states that Eliot said at one time, "No man escapes from the culture which it imposes." And we will see that reflected through what we have analyzed in his search for meaning. He is also a Harvard scholar, and it was at Harvard in which he developed his first poem collection. It was not yet published, but this is where he writes Portrait of a Lady, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and the Preludes. And a few of those are going to be works that we examine later in this presentation. So, in the making of his career, he travels abroad for a short time and then lands himself in London, England in 1914. This is not the time in which he becomes a British citizen, but this is the time in which he has influence from Ezra Pound. And he is noted as being a predominant voice in contemporary English poetry, and that was what he was encouraged to still develop by his mentor, Ezra Pound, at this time. And also in England, that is where he meets his future wife. And in 1915, we have a marriage and we have an early career in which his early works are published. Yet there is a lot of strife that comes within that time period. He has an anxiety-ridden marriage. There's a lot of health problems, a lot of mental health issues, and that is going to be reflected in his poetry as well. Especially come post-war, I say that there's post-war not only culturally but personally that Eliot is grappling with in terms of isolation and weariness, which is predominantly talked about in his poem, The Wasteland, which will also be examined later in this presentation. So it's important to note that, that was his early life. But as we look into analyzing his poems, we're kind of in the in between his early life and what happens after his conversion later in life. And Ackroyd states that the best of that poetry, Eliot once confessed, had cost him dearly in experience. And we're going to see how those experiences shaped what came later in his work. So what? So why study Eliot? Why study the themes? Why study what he has accomplished? Well, he has a role in literary modernism. He has influence in intertextuality and the marriage of the intellect and religion within poetry throughout the development of his work. So Eliot's Modern Society. So starting with when he was developing the works, especially in London, they are riddled with routine, isolation, weariness, and nihilism themes. And to address the intertextuality that he has influenced, he believed that poets do not write in isolation. He's wanting to bridge the gap between the past and present with multiple allusions and references, which we see um, throughout his poetry. Um, and he states in his essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, whereas if we approach a poet without his prejudice, we shall often find that not only the best, but the most individual parts of his work may be those in which the dead poets, his ancestors, assert their immortality most vigorously, which we noted from Ackroyd's biography of him, where his past does reflect what he's bringing into the present. And the way he ends up marrying this intellect and religion from his early works into his later works is through the objective correlative. And he actually coins this in his critique in the essay Hamlet and His Problems, in which he is critiquing Shakespeare's weakness in Hamlet in terms of showing and not telling. And we see examples of him using that objective correlative within his own works, such as the Etherized Patient and the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, in the Shades in the Thousand Rooms that we see in Preludes, the Handful of Dust in the Wasteland, the Three White Leopards in Ash Wednesday, and the Stopped Underground Train in East Coker within four quartets. And you can see that there are early works in which it's about intellect and there's satire versus whenever he becomes more religious later in life. And as he states also in his essay, Hamlet and His Problems, he says, the only way of expressing emotion in the form of art is by finding an objective correlative. In other words, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events, which shall be the formula of that particular emotion, which we see that he is successful in doing. So our central question that we'll be examining is, how does Eliot's poetry reflect his search for meaning?
Hello, everyone. I'm Rachel, and I'm going to try to begin to answer the central question. And I'm going to talk about From City to Civilization and the development of Eliot's early thought from 1911 to 1922. So I ask, how do Eliot's questions expand before his answers emerge? So oftentimes when we think about Eliot's career, most people focused on the dramatic change that happens with Ash Wednesday and the Four Quartets, which came later. It's tempting to view those works as sudden religious conversion, but Eliot's earlier poetry actually tells quite a different story. Rather than suddenly finding faith, Eliot spent more than a decade using increasingly larger questions about meaning, identity, history, and civilization. So that's where I'm going to begin to go into detail. I'm going to first discuss Preludes, where he focuses on the city, from the city to the individual in the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, from J. Alfred Prufrock to Gerontin in 1920, and Civilization, which The Wasteland in 1922. So I think it's really, really important that each poem, then you look at each poem and how they enlarge Eliot's field of vision, because it's critically important. He is showing a lot in his early work. So I'm going to start with Preludes, and I'm going to refer to this as the beginning of the struggle, and that struggle is the struggle for meaning in modern life. And so I've chosen an excerpt from Preludes to discuss, and 10 minutes will not give me even slightly enough time to go over these poems in depth, but I am going to just point out a couple of different things. The burnt out, his word choices here, he's got burnt out, smoky days, um, grimy scraps, vacant lots, a lonely cab horse, All of those imageries um, feel very physical. We don't necessarily encounter a lot of abstract ideas. First, he uses his words to demonstrate um, really the imagery with the feelings. You have smells, weather, dirt, and all of those lovely imageries that come with the city, but they're not just simply descriptions of the city. He's transforming the city into an external representation of spiritual exhaustion. I am going to bring in Marianne Montgomery, who wrote a lovely essay on T.S. Eliot. And Marianne Montgomery said this was the first significant dramatization of this struggle, and that is the struggle for meaning in modern life. And so that is extremely important. From Ackroyd's biography about him, he was around 20 years old when he wrote Preludes. He had already spent some time in Paris, as Marisa pointed out. He came from a relatively wealthy family. He had not yet moved to England, but he was just beginning to reject the romantic poetry of the 19th century. Whoops, technical issues. All right, moving into the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. This was written in 1915, shortly after Preludes. He was at Harvard University studying philosophy. He had questions on religion, he had questions on identity, questions on purpose. He then had moved to England in 1915 and was beginning his work with Ezra Pound during Prufrock. Um, so the highlighted phrases, particularly the one that Marisa mentioned in the introduction, like a patient etherized upon the table, is a very, 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 very important in that sense. Because what he is saying here, he is utilizing this imagery. He is, instead of comparing the evening to something beautiful, he's actually comparing it to anesthesia. So the modern world, Eliot is saying that it isn't simply unpleasant, it is absolutely spiritually numb. And then he asks the question, do I dare disturb the universe? In that sense, he is talking about how small decisions become enormous moral questions. Probably the most famous line, I think, from the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock is I have measured out my life with coffee spoons, because an ordinary household object becomes a symbol of an entire life that is reduced to routine. So in this sense, we had just talked about the struggle. The struggle here actually begins to move inward. And in his essay, Tradition and the Individual Talents, he states that poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. So to go from Preludes, which is the struggle for meaning in modern life, the struggle then moves inward and it becomes a struggle between identity and action. So that being said, I'm going to move on to the next slide. And from Prufrock to Johnson in 1920. So one of the things here with Johnson, he was living in London. His marriage was beginning to deteriorate. He was emotionally exhausted. It is a little different than Prufrock. You see the turn starting to happen. He starts to shift his focus to history. He asks the question here, after such knowledge, what forgiveness? So basically, I think what he's doing in Johnson is he's actually asking, um, what happens when personal crisis is no longer enough? And so that's when he starts to look towards history and says the word history, which I've highlighted. And then he mentions contrived corridors. And again, I've patched different pieces of the poems together. And then he's got thoughts of a dry brain in a dry season. So very much unlike Prufrock in some ways. He never states what forgiveness he's asking for in this. So essentially, he is not presenting history as a teacher. He's presenting history as a maid, which is why I use the image here of Tintern Abbey because it's an excellent representation of Eliot's metaphor. So basically, I think what he is doing here is he's saying that history informs us, but it cannot save us. So he's still, again, struggling to find some meaning through history. Moving on to his most famous work and what is thought to be his masterpiece, which is The Wasteland. At this time in T.S. Eliot's life, 1922, he was suffering from severe physical and mental exhaustion and was actually had spent some time in treatment in Switzerland, had a what we would call a nervous breakdown, um, focusing really on the fragmented world here. So the struggle, which actually, started with, of course, the city to the individual to history now turns to civilization itself. It expands from the individual to an entire civilization. He states things, the progression here. He says unreal city. So we're back to the city, the brown fog, um, back to preludes again, the crowd flowing over London Bridge, and then him saying, I had not thought death had undone so many. Then he utilizes the nursery rhyme, London Bridge is falling down, falling down. But the biggest word in this particular poem, in my opinion, is the word fragments and my ruins. Um, because the word fragments really captures the structure of the entire poem. And then my ruins. The poem ends personally, even after multiple languages, multiple religions, multiple illusions, multiple civilizations. Um, you know, he says death had undone so many. He is actually, I think, referencing or having making an allusion to Dante's procession of souls with the crowd. And I think he is saying that his struggle is everyone's struggle. And with that being said, I don't know what just happened. Um, Hang on. Technical issues. So sorry. Forgive me, guys. I'm so sorry. I don't know what just happened. Okay. All right. So I think that personally, I think that Eliot's work becomes progressively larger. He, like I said, starts from examining a city, one city, then one individual, then history itself, and finally an entire civilization. And while he hasn't yet found answers, I think his early work and the representation of these poems really prepare the questions that make the spiritual turn that Katie's about to discuss for Ash Wednesday possible. His answers don't suddenly appear, they emerge because he first learns to ask the bigger questions. And I think the biggest takeaway that I have is that he's not necessarily becoming more pessimistic. His questions are becoming larger. So now I'll turn it over to Katie.
All right, so we're going to start at a significant turning point in Eliot's life. We know that Eliot disliked explaining his poetry. He disliked having other people try to explain it, particularly when it didn't necessarily match what his vision was. And he really hated it when people suggested his writing was autobiographical. However, all that being said, we recognize that he had some significant life events. And after those significant life events, his focus and his themes and his poetry does seem to shift in a different direction. It does seem to turn. So we know Eliot became a British citizen in 1927. He converted from Unitarianism to Anglo-Catholicism in the same year. He had an increased interest in drama. After his conversion, he believed that even secular drama attracts people who are seeking religion, who are seeking answers to questions like he was. And so he wrote a series of plays. These plays focused on tragedies because of sin. Murder in the Cathedral is a modern miracle play based on a martyr. And we see a difference in his themes. And those themes also shift to his poems as well. It's essentially the equivalent of the light slowly turning back on. So his questions had gotten bigger, and as the questions got bigger, they got harder to answer, and the poems essentially, in many ways, got darker. And now there is that shift. And so, in order to prove that, we're going to examine two of his most famous later poems, Ash Wednesday and Four Quartets. There are similarities there. He still wrestled with questions. Eliot didn't stop asking hard questions, but the way he approached them and some of the answers he proposed did change. Unfortunately, we cannot do these poems justice in the time we have, and so we're going to briefly scan them for major themes and allusions and pictures that will help us get an understanding of the main ideas of his work. So we're going to look at Ash Wednesday first. Ash Wednesday was recognized universally as a religious poem when it came out. Eliot was criticized for it. People did not think that poetry should be that heavily rooted in religion. Later on, critics came to call it one of the great religious poems of our language. There are heavy biblical allusions throughout, as opposed to earlier works in which Eliot focused on more classic references, such as Wagner or even ragtime music, Dante, allusions such as that. He still has some of those, but the amount of biblical allusions increases dramatically. He still acknowledges failures and problems, but it takes on a more confessional tone. It takes the idea of a conversation with God. There's a lot more direct address in this poem. There are more religious themes throughout, and there's more hope in it than in some of the previous poems. Many of them didn't have any answer to the questions. Ash Wednesday seems to at least suggest that there are answers. And there's this distinct turn or change of thought with repetition of words like the turn, because although other ones that indicate a change. Themes of Ash Wednesday include ones he'd already talked about, like penance, failure, judgment, unworthiness, questioning this search for knowledge. Death is still present, but we have new ones added too, such as mercy and redemption, the idea not only of death, but of creation and new life, and an increased emphasis on prayer. And so we begin looking directly at the poem. This is from section 1 of Ash Wednesday. We see the number of times that Eliot refers to praying to God. He refers to the importance of sitting still and listening to truth, letting go of the world and its cares. We see his prayer that he may forget these matters, that with myself I too much discuss, the things that have burdened him. We see prayer as an answer. We see the availability of mercy. This, I pray to God to have mercy upon us. That wasn't present in earlier poems. And the idea that knowledge is available. If you look at the end of these lines, we have the idea of teaching us. Teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to sit still. That there is the existence of a higher being, and there is absolute truth, and we can know it because this other higher being, this God, knows it. In section 2, we have a new set of lines. This is one of the key images of the poem. We have this reference to the dry bones and can these bones live? This is a clear reference to Ezekiel and the Valley of the Dry Bones in the Bible. It is a really key part of this poem. It suggests the possibility of rebirth, of new life, of having new purpose in what had been hopeless and dead, not refusing to acknowledge the death, but saying that something good can still come out of it because of goodness and loveliness and meditation and prayer and all of these new ideas that Eliot's adding to his poems. It continues in lines 62 through 65 of section 2. We see the idea of, again, there's a direct quotation of Ezekiel in the command to prophesy to the wind, but we also see an increased sense of purpose and meaning in life, the idea of devotion. So we have thus devoted, concentrated in purpose. We have essentially a call from God saying, hey, go do this thing. and suggesting that life does have meaning and what we do and say matters. And even if it feels like sometimes we're prophesying to the wind. The next section is in lines 92 through 95. This is also key because Eliot presents another picture of the desert. And you'll remember there was also a picture of the desert in the wasteland of this red land in which there's no water and there's thunder, but it never brings rain. And there's all of these leering faces. And this is a direct shift. There's still desert, there's still problems and suffering and all of this in life. But now we have quiet, that there is an inheritance and we can have peace even in the desert. So it not only alludes to Israel's inheritance by Lot, but it has this picture of completion and peace and contentment even in the desert. Section 3 has some other pictures. Again, we see a sense of calling and purpose, a similar allusion to the way God called the prophets. And the prophets would reply, "I'm not worthy, Lord." And he would essentially tell them, "But I'm calling you, and so you are worthy." And we see the idea that action and speech has meaning. So Eliot repeats their cry. It's in the church's catechism as well, I believe, the Lord, I'm not worthy, Lord, I'm not worthy. And then we have the responses, speak the word anyway, essentially here. Section 4 of Ash Wednesday, we have the fountain, we have a bird. It talks about redeeming the time, which is a direct allusion to Ephesians. And it is also a picture, again, repeated throughout this poem. We see the idea of what we're doing, what we're saying, it matters, it has meaning. There is a purpose to life. It's not just a wasteland. Yes, there's suffering, there's desert, there's pain, but there's something else too. There's something to look forward to. So we move on to section 5. Eliot has this beautiful rewording with ideas drawn from John 1. We still see, this is an important section because we see his struggle to find meaning and truth. He's not pretending that all the answers are suddenly there, that all the questions are answered, but he is pointing to the fact that there is an ultimate truth. It does exist, and we can potentially know it through knowing the being that created truth. And these aren't key thoughts that we find in his earlier poems. So then we move to section 6. Ash Wednesday concludes with this passage. It is key. Again, it repeats the idea of being still. It repeats the idea that we can find peace in God's will and in his truth. There is a direct plea to God for him to remain with the speaker in the poem, for God to hear his prayer. And this is a notably more positive and hopeful ending than we see in his earlier poetry. Again, he's not out of the rocks. It says, teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to sit still, even among these rocks, our peace in his will, even among these rocks. There are still hard things, but peace is attainable and God is present with him. And that lets him end this poem more positively and find more hope than was present before. Moving on to 4 quartets. This is seen very much as a public-facing picture of spirituality, seen as essentially his mature Christianity coming together with his poetic ability. The world is portrayed as integrated, controlled, and comprehensive. It's not necessarily meant to be didactic as much as it's supposed to be a dramatic meditation. It doesn't tell us what we should feel or what we should do about it, but it shows us how a believer might feel and some of the questions and thoughts and conversations going on in their brain as they search for answers and potentially find it in religion. It's an attempt to reconcile real life with spiritual realities, and it is very interesting. If you want to go to the next slide, the themes are meditation, prayer, redemption. And again, we see this key idea, the rehabilitation of time and poetic diction, that again, what you say, what you do matters, that forgiveness is available, and we don't have to stay in the chaos and despair and loneliness. So if we look at in Burnt Norton, some of the key lines here, we see a consistent awareness of eternity throughout Eliot's work in the 4 quartets. We see the importance of words and of God, the idea that words themselves can be eternal, they can reach forward and backward and influence other people. We see that which is living can only die, And so death becomes more downplayed in these poems than it was before. And there is more hope for after that death. It doesn't end there. The next section, we see in East Coker lines about being still and still moving, the idea that there is something deeper, there's something more important. We're not just aimlessly wandering, but we're moving toward something, in his words, into another intensity for a further union, a deeper communion. And we see him looking forward. In my end is my beginning. And so the idea again that we don't have to end with the questions and the despair and the sense of loss. There's something more to life than that. East Coker also has a really clear allusion to Good Friday, a reference to communion and Christ's death. It shows Eliot still looking at man as not enough. Man is to some extent deluded if we in these lines, in spite of what we like to think that we are sound, substantial flesh and blood. That man doesn't have all the answers. It's not enough. But we see this shift that there is something or someone that exists that is sufficient. And so there is hope. The next section, this is still from East Coker. There's a reference to Ecclesiastes, the idea that there's nothing new under the sun and that life is this consistent cycle of beginnings and endings. We see the theme of rebirth really clearly. Even more clearly in the next lines, we see in my beginning is my end, and we see the picture, next slides, of the old stone to new building and old timber to new fire. That something new can be created from the old. There is a hope for new things after death or pain or suffering. That's not the end of the story. We don't have to stop there. Moving on to the next section of the four quartets, we see an increased emphasis on prayer. This again is a key part because it's a clear contrast to his earlier work in The Wasteland when he talked about people dying at sea. It was a lot more morbid, it was a lot more hopeless. It just reminded people that they were once as handsome and strong as this man who died in the sea. And now, instead of having that memory, Eliot brings in prayer that we should pray for those in ships and those who have sent out family in the ships, and even those who still have died. That they can be, there's focus on prayer as a solution, and a significant contrast with his previous writing about deaths at sea. And then finally, we look at Little Gidding. There's some really key passages here as well. We have the idea that it's okay not to know all the answers. Again, Eliot never stopped questioning. He still had big questions and he was looking for big answers, but now it's leading to prayer instead of hopelessness or mental breakdowns or the idea of that life is just meaningless. And so we see these lines: you are not here to verify, instruct yourself, or inform curiosity or carry report. You are here to kneel where prayer has been valid. And so prayer is given in these later poems over and over again as a solution when you have questions you can't answer. And then finally, we get to the conclusion of Little Gidding. And again, this is a much more positive end to his poems than we see in earlier ones. He has the idea that we're going to keep searching, we're going to keep asking questions, but eventually we can understand truth. So we see the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So truth is there, it's real, it's attainable at some point in the future. And then we see these final lines giving essentially happy ending, that all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well when the tongues of flame are infolded into the crowned knot of fire and the fire and the rose are one. So there is this hopeful vision for the future that he leaves the readers with, which was not really present in a lot of the earlier poems, where the darkness is kind of where it ended because he didn't have answers. And so now he has this at least hope, if not the answer themselves, he has a hope for answers all throughout these later works.
Okay. So now that we've looked closely at some of his early and later works, I'm going to give an overview of the development of his writing from fragmentation to faith. We've discussed in the last several weeks the way Eliot's poetry illustrates modernist literature with fragmentation, and he focuses so much of his early work on the fractured world, a spiritually broken world, specifically post-World War I. But his poetry reflects so much more than that. it truly reflects his search for meaning, even through difficult times. It recognizes the spiritual and social disillusionment, but yet he continues to hope, find connections, and seek a higher purpose. So the early works that Rachel talked about, much of the fragmentation we see in his early works includes nonlinear structures, shifting perspectives, and disembodied imagery. And personally, I found that disembodied imagery fascinating. For example, in the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, he has various lines that read, and I have known the eyes already, and I have known the arms already, and then goes on to mention ragged claws and long fingers. And basically, these are scattered, isolated, fragmented body parts, not whole people. So it effectively highlights the fragmented and fractured psychological state of the people who were consumed by alienation, isolation, anxiety. And then in Preludes, Eliot uses phrases which Rachel used as well in one of her examples, but he uses phrases such as burnt out ends of smoky days, grimy scraps, withered leaves, vacant lots. And those are used in order to mirror a fragmented physical state by highlighting life in the middle of urban decay. And then his focus shifts from urban decay to the decaying state of mind. In Gerontian, he implements a stream of consciousness of disconnected thoughts. For example, he writes, signs taken for wonders. We would see a sign swaddled with darkness. And then he also says, to be eaten, to be divided, to be drunk among whispers. Eliot uses these images to offer a glimpse into a society that's ruminating in the past. And his statement is about what happens to us when society loses sight of their foundations in religion and history. It's a collapse of culture. And then finally, in The Wasteland, this one has been called the pinnacle of modernist fragmentation. Eliot disregards linear structure in the poem in order to highlight the post-war world where any connection to society or religion has shattered. His poem moves across time, voices, languages, and we have to find some sort of order amid all of that chaos. Okay, and then now we're looking at faith. We've looked at fragmentation, now faith. So now we move from the early works of fragmentation to the faith that we witness from his later poems, such as Ash Wednesday and the Four Quartets. And these offer a response to that earlier fragmentation. So it's important to note that the fragmentation in his poetry still exists. It just changes. There's a shift in Eliot's search for meaning. It's now redirected toward exploring spirituality, religion, and the search for redemption. And this comes after his conversion to Christianity in 1927. So we can infer that these poems mirror his own spiritual development. So with Ash Wednesday, this one is famously known as his conversion poem, and it highlights the struggle of transitioning from spiritual emptiness to repentance and then eventually rebirth. And with Four Quartets, this one's known as the poetic embodiment of wisdom, spiritual maturity, and cultural renewal. It's essentially the culmination of his spiritual development, and it implies that society and culture can and will find spiritual meaning in life and redemption that results in divine love and spiritual unity. On this slide, we're focusing on the evolution and the development. So it's basically an overview of everything that was covered in the previous slides. We're just focusing on how Eliot's poetry reflects the search for meaning. So this is the evolution of that search as we see the shift from his early works that focused on fragmentation, alienation, cultural decay, uncertainty, and meaninglessness. And then we see how his later work shifts and it develops into themes of spiritual integration, communion with God, religious renewal, faith, and tradition, and ultimately hope for redemption. So one of the questions that we looked at with Eliot's poetry is, does Eliot's body of work ultimately offer a vision of hope, or does it simply offer a different way of understanding suffering? So the answer to this question is both. In essence, hope and suffering go hand in hand. So first, the vision of hope. His work does offer a vision of hope, but it was an arduous journey to get there and could only be reached through an understanding of and endurance of suffering. And then next comes the transformation. It required transformation. So Eliot's work was never an escape from pain or suffering. Instead, it was a transformation of it. So experiencing pain was a vital part of eventually arriving at hope. And some examples of that in the third box there at the top. This is an example of how these two work together. And so this is a quote from Burnt Norton in Four Quartets. And the quote is, "The still point of the turning world." And the turning world in this quote represents the life that's chaotic and it's painful. So that's the suffering. But the still point that's mentioned is the hope. So this is the eternal peace and the divine love, and all of that is at the center of it. So in the bottom box, the search for meaning, I thought this quote pretty much summed it up. His depiction of disillusionment isn't without hope. Instead, it creates a space for readers to discover connection, meaning, and purpose, even in times of cultural and spiritual uncertainty. And then next, we have the two sides of redemption. The two sides, again, are hope and suffering. Hope is ultimately realized when humanity acknowledges that suffering and love are not opposites. When seeking redemption, they're actually two sides of the same experience. And then the last box there is a quote from Little Gidding from Four Quartets. And the quote is, "All shall be well when fire and rose are one." So again, we see how the two work together. Fire is the pain and the suffering experienced on the journey. And then the rose is the hope. It's the redemption, the love, and the beauty. Okay, so the central question that Marisa actually mentioned in the very beginning was, how does Eliot's poetry reflect his search for meaning? As after going through all of the poetry and the all of the slides, I thought, again, this quote kind of reflects it the best and says it the best, that his poetry reflects the search for meaning because despite the fragmentation of the contemporary world, introspection, a strong bond with tradition, and a profound engagement with eternal spiritual truths are all necessary steps toward healing and spiritual renewal. And that's precisely what Eliot's poetry does. So on behalf of my group, thank you. And since our focus was on the development of Eliot's writing and thinking over time, and we concluded that suffering was a necessary part of finally reaching hope and redemption, we're going to leave you with this quote from East Coker of the Four Quartets. "I said to my soul, be still and wait without hope, for hope would be hope for the wrong thing. There is yet faith, but the faith and the love and the hope are all in the waiting." So thank you. The next 4 slides are our reference slides. And so if you want any additional information, you're welcome to look through those.